Well, my view is that the international response has been very positive and very aggressive thus far. There has been a number of significant scientific assessments responding to the emerging questions around the impacts of black carbon on our climate. And among those is an important study conducted in 2011 by the United Nations Environment Program to look at what measures could be adopted to control not only black carbon but also tropospheric ozone. And that study identified 16 measures total, and among those, 2 of them were specifically related to the transportation sector, and they included measures to require technologies like the diesel particulate filter on all diesel engines that are newly manufactured, as well as measures to address emissions from some of the highest emitting vehicles in the fleet, and to effectively either remove them from the fleet or to retrofit them with filter technology. So with that study and with the international assessments that have been conducted, there has been a new initiative created by some countries, a voluntary initiative called the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. To me, this represents the first true global mobilization around the issue of black carbon. But it's not specific to transportation. It does have a number of initiatives, one of which does address transportation. And that initiative is the Heavy-Duty Diesel Initiative, which is very focused on black carbon from the transportation sector. I'm encouraged by the activities that that initiative is taking, but I don't think that that initiative alone will be enough. And what we really will need on a global scale is for countries to recognize this linkage between the climate impacts of black carbon and the local public health impacts that emissions from the transportation sector are causing, so that we can capture both the local interest in air pollution and link that to the global interest in addressing climate change. So we have a lot of experience looking at diesel emissions control from countries in North America and in Europe, but also Japan. And the experience basically tells us that there are 2 core strategies, and they are primarily focused really on diesel engines, but not to the exclusion of others. We still care about gasoline engines of certain types as well. And so the basic approach is, first, measures to address new engines that are manufactured. And the strategy here is to require that those engines meet a certain emissions level for particulate matter. And in our field, we refer to these as the Euro 6 emission standards. So the approach is really to require new engines to meet Euro 6 standards. And for these standards to be effective, they require a matching policy for fuel, because the technology that these engines use cannot operate with high levels of sulfur in the fuel. And so for that reason, the standards themselves must be matched by limits on fuel sulfur quality. And so in general terms, we're talking about no greater than 10 parts per million sulfur in that fuel. The benefit of the change in fuel quality is that it can also impact emissions from the existing vehicles in the fleet. And so what that means is that when we look at a whole strategy, looking not just at the new engines but also the existing engines, that we can address existing engines by taking advantage of this low sulfur fuel. And what strategies are needed in the what we call the in-use fleet, or the vehicles that are already on the road, is a set of programs that encourage the more rapid repair and, in some cases, scrappage, which is a way of saying the removal of the highest emitting vehicles from the fleet. And there are studies that tell us that these kinds of programs that either remove or repair the existing vehicles can achieve, in some countries, and especially in countries that have some of the oldest emission standards, could achieve nearly equivalent emissions benefits and air quality benefits as a new engine strategy. So in general, then, what we really need, both in the developing and the developed countries, is two sets of programs. One that addresses the new engines, and another that addresses the existing engines, supported both by a set of fuel quality standards. So a transition to 10 ppm sulfur is a major need globally if we are going to realize the benefits, the climate and health benefits of diesel controls and black carbon controls in the transportation sector. Historically, what we've seen is that the countries that really produce and consume the most number of vehicles in the world have financed for themselves the change in the fuel refining that exists within their countries. So this has taken place in the United States, for example, which is, I believe, the largest oil consumer in the world, and is exporting fuel as well, refined fuel. And so you have one set of countries that will have the resources to invest in their own refining. I'll add to that list China. India is also investing their own resources in refinery upgrades. But then there are another set of countries, and really these are countries that don't refine their own fuels at all. These are fuels that import. These are countries that import fuel, and Sri Lanka is an example of a country that is importing fuel and has taken a leap forward by choosing to import what previously was 500 parts per million sulfur and going directly to 10 parts per million sulfur. And I'm told that to them it was an easy decision because the price difference between those two fuels was only something like 5 rupees. And what that fuel transition allows for them is the direct leap to a Euro 6 emission standard. So these kinds of fuel importing countries have particular advantages because they don't have to mobilize the amount of resources to invest in their existing refinery systems, which in some cases may require quite a bit of resources. So then we're left with a third group of countries which do have their own refining capacity, but may not have the right resources available. And so the question then is how those countries can make a transition without incurring too great a cost. And so there are basically two general solutions to that. One is to seek some kind of multilateral financing or financing from institutions like the World Bank, for example, which is actively interested in these kinds of investments, and there in fact is a black carbon finance study group that's actively exploring which refineries specifically should be invested in to produce low sulfur fuel. The other basic strategy is to seek private sector financing, and there are examples where refineries have been able to procure investment from the private sector, since in some cases there may be a good business case to be made for such investments and profit to be made from this kind of transition. So these are some of the ways that we're seeing this transition and investment in 10 ppm, and I think it will happen. But at its core, the very first step for any country is to make a public commitment to that transition. And once a country has made that public commitment, then that sends a signal to the international community who might have financing. It sends a signal as well to the auto manufacturers who can begin to sell vehicles that meet these low emissions in their market. And it's the signal itself, independent of the actual implementation, that is a very powerful move that I would suggest every country consider if they haven't yet made such a commitment. So the public health concerns are local concerns that are driven by local circumstances, and the starting point for any country is to first recognize the problem and admit that there is a problem. Because for those of us who don't live in a country that has high pollution levels, we can offer support, but we cannot force action. the action has to be something that the country itself is invested in and is committed to taking. So for me, the starting point is for any country that has a public health problem and an air quality problem, that it recognize it and that it make a decision to make a move to addressing it. And so knowing that the solutions to these public health concerns also have climate benefits means that countries that have made such a commitment or undertaken such a recognition of this problem, that they can appeal to an international community who, because of this climate change issue, has vested interest in seeing that the local health concerns be addressed, because we all benefit. So there are these international institutions that I think countries can appeal to, and I've mentioned the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is one. But there are other institutions, in fact, that have a very specific role in addressing international air pollution. And so I'll mention the International Maritime Organization as an example. So the International Maritime Organization is the UN-sponsored body that has jurisdiction over the emissions from international shipping in international waters. And the IMO has, starting in 2011, undertaken its own research plan on black carbon. And this research plan includes an assessment of the measures to control black carbon from international shipping. That research plan, I think, sends a really powerful signal to countries interested in their local air pollution problems, and may in fact help to address those by requiring lower sulfur fuels in the marine bunker fuel that ships purchase and use, by requiring things like emission control areas and enforcing their implementation. And now that's an example where countries can use emission control areas within their domestic waters to utilize the resources of the IMO and the regulatory authority of the IMO to limit the emissions from international ships entering their domestic waters. So I think this is a good example of how the local public health issues interact with the global issues. And there is another mechanism that I'm aware of, which is the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, which is something that's really unique to North America and to Europe, but has undertaken effectively a global scientific assessment of air pollution and the ways in which air pollution travels across boundaries, across oceans. And to me, this is a very important activity that helps inform the work that all of us are doing on air pollution across the world. So for any country that's interested in dealing with these local issues, there are these global institutions and activities that exist. And so, like I said earlier, it's the recognition that there's a problem, and the second is that there be a commitment to dealing with the problem. And once the commitment is made public, that the country can then stand on sort of solid ground to appeal to the international community for support and help if it's needed. So the main reason is that diesel emissions have a high share of black carbon in them. And as we've discussed, black carbon is a very important pollutant that has strong climate impacts. But diesel engines also have a very significant health impact as well. And we've discussed the way in which the World Health Organization and the International Agency for Research on Cancer has categorized diesel exhaust as a human carcinogen, which is the most powerful statement the WHO can make about the health impacts of anything. And so we now have a strong basis to say that diesel exhaust has both this health impact, which is directly related to lung cancer, but also other adverse health impacts as well, and that includes cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular disease, which is basically a source of strokes, and other adverse health impacts. And we have this UNEP integrated assessment report on black carbon and tropospheric ozone, which says that controlling diesel emissions and taking two specific actions, as I mentioned earlier, on the new engines and also on the existing fleet of high emitters, is a win-win strategy for climate and for health. And so these are I think, two very strong endorsements of any action on diesel emissions control. And it points us in the direction of the technologies and the policy strategies that can achieve that control. So really, I don't think there's a debate at this point about whether we should control the emissions. The question is really, for those who agree with that statement, how to implement those controls and how to do it in the most cost-effective and rapid manner. So my feeling on this is that black carbon should not be addressed within the UNFCCC, and I feel very strongly about this. And the reason I say that is because the UNFCCC is designed with a very specific intent, and that is to mitigate adverse climate impacts over the long term. And all the climate science is very clear that carbon dioxide is the #1 driving force that will determine the long-term climate impacts. And so the world has already adopted a goal of mitigating global temperature change to no greater than 2 degrees centigrade. Carbon dioxide controls are going to determine whether or not we meet that goal. Black carbon and other short-lived climate pollutants will help us meet that goal, but only to an extent. And in fact, we should think about black carbon and other short-lived climate pollutants as having really a short-term impact, and the controls on those as having a short-term benefit for climate specifically. Of course, we have long-term benefits for public health by controlling these pollutants. And so I like to look at the models that are now being developed by Norway and by the state of California, who are actively exploring how to incorporate black carbon and other short-lived climate pollutants into their climate mitigation strategies. And the basic approach that they're taking is that they're using carbon dioxide controls and other long-lived gases, I should say controls on other long-lived gases, as their core climate strategy. But what they're also doing is they're recognizing the climate impacts of black carbon and other short-lived climate pollutants, and they're seeing how actions on those pollutants specifically complements what they are already doing on carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases. And so you end up with a framework where you have effectively two baskets of pollutants and two baskets of strategies. And the foundation of climate action starts with one basket of gases, which are the Kyoto gases, and a set of measures that are taken to implement controls on those gases in the most cost-effective and rapid manner. And then you layer on top of that a second set of actions based on an assessment of the science around the climate benefits and other benefits, for that matter, of controlling the short-lived climate pollutants. And you look at what actions have not yet been taken on the basis of the climate impacts of those pollutants. And so you layer on top of your foundation that additional set of actions. And so you end up with a comprehensive set of actions for addressing the climate impacts of the long-lived gases, and that are targeted at the long-term sort of peak temperature change. And you have this additional set of actions that are addressing the rest of the climate impacts that are being caused by the other pollutants, that will support and help us to achieve our long-term goals, but that will give us, in fact, additional near-term benefits that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And so in this way, you're addressing, to the greatest extent possible, all of the climate impacts caused by all the pollutants that are emitted. So I think it's a really important question when we think about these modes, these diesel modes. So you mentioned marine, off-road, and rail. If our interest and focus is on black carbon within the transport sector, we need to look at every single diesel engine in the transport sector, no matter where it is and what its operations are for. And so we don't want to demonize diesel engines for as a bad technology, because in fact diesel engines are a very important technology, especially for the movement of freight. They play a very special role in economic development, and for that reason a number of countries actually subsidize diesel fuel as a form of economic policy. But the unfortunate fact is that diesel exhaust is harmful in many ways, and that has been widely recognized now and addressed. And so we can point to many countries that have addressed the problem of diesel exhaust and continue to address the problem. But the way in which diesel engines have been addressed has been first to focus on those diesel engines that are closest to us. And that includes primarily the passenger cars that we drive to and from work or to school. And it includes the commercial trucks that are carrying goods from our ports to warehouses and to our grocery stores. Those tend to be the ones that are given the most focus. And in fact, when we look at global emission inventories of black carbon, that these modes account for about just half of the black carbon within the transport sector. So then it begs the question, well, what's the other half? And the other half is these other modes you've just mentioned, marine, rail, and off-road. And so the approach to these other modes should be exactly the same as the approach to passenger cars and commercial trucks. It's to require that the newest engines for marine, rail, and off-road basically have technologies equivalent to those on passenger cars and heavy-duty trucks, and that the dirtiest, highest polluting, oldest engines in the marine, rail, and off-road sectors basically be removed or repaired or retrofitted in some way. And if we do that, then we're dealing with the other half of the problem. And so again, going back to fuel, if we're investing in fuel refining to get to 10 ppm, then that'll be available to all of these diesel engines regardless. So it just demonstrates how fuel is core to any kind of diesel emission reduction strategy, and any commitment to address diesel emissions really has to start with how we make sure we provide the fuel, and how we make sure that the fuel that's being consumed by the diesel engines is actually meeting the specifications that are required by law. So I think that in any comprehensive program to deal with diesel black carbon, we have to look at all of these modes. And I think that there are many examples out there from North America, from Europe, from Japan, even now from China. Mexico is going to start to implement similar programs beginning in 2018. We can point to all of these examples to see what have been the lessons learned and what are the best practices that the rest of the world should look towards. Outsider is that in China, the politicians at the highest level have recognized the problem and have committed to solving it. These commitments have taken the form of a fuel roadmap to 10 ppm. So nationwide, China will have 10 ppm fuel by 2018. It also includes commitments to implement the China 5 standards, and commitments that are required under the State Council of China to require more aggressive measures in the most polluted parts of the country. And that includes what they refer to as the key regions. So that would be the Jing-Jin-Ji region, which includes Beijing. It includes Shanghai as a second key region, and then Guangzhou and the Pearl River Delta and Guangdong province as a third key region. And so the government has recognized air pollution is severe in these regions and also in general across the country, and it is forcing local officials and decision makers to implement programs to meet air quality standards. They're making investments in their refineries to upgrade to the fuel, and there is a real serious undertaking now to dramatically reduce air pollution in China. To be honest, I don't see that level of interest here in India. I don't see politicians making public statements, committing the country to a 10 ppm sulfur roadmap, and sending signals to the auto industry in particular about the timeline for that roadmap. I hope that that happens soon, and I do think, in fact, that it can and will happen soon. But in addition to that kind of a commitment, we really also need to see India adopt a timeline for achieving the Euro 6 emission standards at the fastest timeline possible. And so the ICT thinks that this could happen by 2020. I hope it happens by 2020. We've done a number of studies that demonstrate that it's possible to do this by 2020. And so the question now is whether the Indian government can commit to that timeline, because at any slower pace, the health impacts will only get worse. And the air quality of people living in Delhi, but also other major metro areas throughout India, will continue to get worse as well. Well, specifically for Delhi, you know, the measures within the transportation sector are those that I mentioned earlier that constitute sort of three core elements. The provision of the lowest sulfur fuel, the 10 ppm fuel, the certain requirements on new engines and upgrade of those new engines, and then programs on existing engines. So there are limits to the authority that the Delhi government itself has to control things like new engine standards. But there are examples throughout the world of major metro areas adopting an additional set of complementary actions that don't put requirements on the manufacturers, but actually put requirements on the consumers. And so some examples, the idea basically is that you label a vehicle based on its emissions level. And so in Beijing, they have every new vehicle that's sold can only be operated if it has a label on it. Their latest label is the blue label for the China 5 or Euro 5 equivalent standard. And the way that Beijing is using these labels is that they actually restrict the vehicles with yellow labels, that is, vehicles that are the highest emitters. They restrict those from entering the city. And so this requires a program of enforcement. Usually it requires some cooperation with the police, the local police, to enforce that. There are other countries that actually grant police authority to the environmental agencies, like in California, the California Air Resources Board has its own enforcement division, and they have a number of staff that go out and enforce the air quality regulations, independent of what the police are doing. But this is a kind of approach that cities can take, where they actively restrict the operation of the highest emitting vehicles within their city. Another action that cities can take is cities tend to have a good deal of control and authority over public fleets. So this could include bus fleets, but it could also include other sort of centralized fleets like garbage trucks, Some of them may be publicly operated, some of them may be privately operated, postal vehicles. But what's common to some of these centralized fleets is that typically they're large, and that they're owned by one or just a handful of companies, and they also fuel their vehicles at one or just a few central locations. And so one action that a city can do is make targeted investments in the fuel that is given to these centralized fleets. And so that could include investments in refueling stations to provide 10 ppm sulfur. It could include CNG fueling as well. I know in Delhi that there already is a requirement that the buses have CNG. So I think that Delhi has already made a good step there. And in fact, I see that as a model for other cities around the world. But there may be other fleets as well that could take up these kinds of investments, and that could benefit from a centralized access point for the cleanest fuel. And then to the extent that some of these fleets are registered or regulated in any way by the Delhi government, that those regulations could require that those fleets only purchase new vehicles that meet a Euro 6 standard, for example. And so these are some examples that a metropolitan area could apply, and a metropolitan area like Delhi could apply in trying to manage its local air pollution issues. But one final thought is that the air pollution in Delhi is not just caused by the vehicles operating in Delhi. It's caused by pollution that's coming from around the city as well. And so I think that there should also be some interest by Delhi officials to perhaps look outside of its region, to actually cooperate with other regions around the area, and to work collectively to address these problems at a grander scale. And I'll just point to Beijing as another example here, where the Beijing Environment Protection Bureau is actually working with the provinces around the Beijing area to create one centralized regional air quality division. And I believe this is going to do a lot to control the kinds of vehicles that are coming into Beijing that may not actually be registered in Beijing, and which Beijing may not have the authority to control. But through cooperation with these other provinces, they can come up with one kind of centralized program that could manage perhaps the bulk or all of the vehicles that are coming into the city. So these are some examples that I think could be useful.